The world, in 1979, was a tapestry of wire-taut tensions and glacial silences. The Cold War was not a hot war, but a deep, permeating chill that seeped into the very machinery of nations. Its front lines were not trenches, but invisible lines in the ionosphere, in the static of encrypted radios, and in the sweeping, ceaseless gaze of early warning radars. One of the most vigilant of these electronic sentinels was a site perched on the bleak, wind-scoured coast of the Bering Sea. Here, American operators watched blips and echoes dance across green, phosphorescent screens, a monotonous ballet of commercial airliners, military patrols, and the occasional migratory flock of birds. It was a duty of profound boredom, punctuated by moments of heart-stopping adrenaline. The anomaly appeared not with a dramatic flash, but as a persistent, stubborn ghost. It was a return echo so faint it was almost dismissed as atmospheric clutter, a trick of the aurora perhaps, or a temperature inversion bending radar waves. But it wouldn't go away. It was a tiny, slow, metallic object, a whisper against the void, cruising at an altitude that made the senior technician on duty that night rub his eyes and recalibrate his scope. The numbers were unequivocal: 90,000 feet. At that altitude, the rules of aviation physics were rewritten. The air was a thin, bitter soup, offering almost no lift for wings, almost no oxygen for combustion. It was the realm of the specialized. The Lockheed U-2, that delicate glider-like spy plane, could claw its way up there, its pilot encased in a pressure suit, the aircraft balanced on a knife edge of stall speed. The newer, faster SR-31 Blackbird could soar even higher, but it was a roaring, titanic expenditure of engineering and fuel. Satellites, of course, lived higher still, but they moved with the predictable celestial mechanics of orbital mechanics, fast, in a great arc. This was different. The blip moved with a languid, almost insolent slowness. It wasn't an orbit. It wasn't a balloon. The radar cross-section was all wrong, too structured, too metallic, and it most certainly wasn't supposed to be able to stay there. The technician called his supervisor. Soon, the quiet hum of the radar station was replaced by a sharper, more urgent energy. Phones were picked up, secure lines were activated, NORAD, deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, was alerted. The object was plotted, tracked, analyzed. Its flight path was a slow, meandering drift from the west. Its signature, when parsed through the nascent computer filters of the time, had a certain telltale texture, a construction philosophy that looked Soviet? But that made no sense. Soviet strategic bombers flew high and fast, but not this high and this slow. A MiG-25 Foxbat could intercept high-flying targets, but it couldn't loiter at this edge of space. This object had no business existing in any known inventory. A chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind settled over the station. They were looking at a silhouette, a blank space in the shape of an aircraft. Its origin was a question mark buried in layers of Siberian frost and state secrecy. Its purpose was an enigma drifting in the stratosphere. Was it a sensor, a provocateur, a precursor to something far more ominous? All they knew for certain was that it was there, a silent, unblinking eye looking down from a throne of thin air, a throne everyone had thought was unassailable. It had flown too high for any conventional fighter to reach, too high for most surface-to-air missiles to be effective, and in doing so, it had instantly rendered a vast swath of defended airspace transparent. To understand the object, one must travel back a decade and a world away, to the heart of a Siberian winter so profound it felt less like a season and more like a geological fact. The city of Novosibirsk, a testament to Soviet industrial might, lay under a perpetual blanket of factory smoke and crystalline frost. On its outskirts, accessible only by a guarded road that cut through endless silver birch forests, stood a cluster of unmarked utilitarian buildings. This was not a premier design bureau like Mikoyan Gurevich or Sukhoi. This was a subsidiary, a backwater of aviation science, a place where projects that were too speculative, too bizarre, or too politically risky for the mainstream were sent to either flourish in secret or die in obscurity. Inside a hangar whose heating system fought a losing battle against the cold, a small team of engineers, men whose names would never grace a history book, huddled around their creation. The air smelled of kerosene, cold metal, and the sharp tang of soldering flux. Their mandate from Moscow, delivered by a middle-ranking bureaucrat with carefully worded ambiguity, was to explore asymmetrical solutions for high-altitude observation. In plainer language, find a way to look over the enemy's fence without getting caught and do it on a budget that wouldn't buy a new wing for a MiG. The team leader was a man named Viktor Grechko, a brilliant aerodynamic specialist who had fallen out of favor at Tupolev for championing unorthodox designs. He was thin, chain-smoked paparosi, and had eyes that squinted as if perpetually looking into a technical drawing only he could see. His inspiration came not from jet turbines or rocket engines, but from the most humble of vehicles, the weather balloon. He watched them ascend from the nearby meteorological station, simple envelopes of latex or polyethylene, carrying instrument packages into the upper atmosphere on the strength of nothing but buoyant gas. What if you could, he mused, give a balloon a brain, a means of propulsion, a way to steer? The result, after 3 years of trial, error, and bureaucratic shielding by a sympathetic general in Moscow, was the Izdelya 23K. It was a hybrid, a mongrel machine that defied easy classification. At its core was a helium-filled envelope, not of rubber, but of a revolutionary, ultra-thin metallized polyester film developed for the space program. This gave it its lift and its staggering service ceiling. Beneath the silvery, bulbous head hung a skeletal fuselage, a lightweight truss of titanium and aluminum alloys. At the rear, a tiny, modified turbojet engine, scavenged from a decommissioned cruise missile, provided just enough thrust for controlled flight. Strapped to the fuselage were spindly, long wings with a glider's high aspect ratio, designed to wring every ounce of lift from the wisps of atmosphere at 80,000 feet. Its payload was a masterpiece of miniaturization, a panoramic film camera with a lens ground by opticians in Leningrad capable of snapping high-resolution images through a quartz window, and a rudimentary electronic intelligence suite to vacuum up radio and radar signals. Its guidance system was its Achilles heel, a pre-programmed autopilot that relied on a barometric altimeter and a gyroscopic compass. It was simple to avoid jamming, but fragile and stupid. There was no data link. Once launched, the ICD-23K was on its own, a mechanical dandelion seed cast into the jet stream. The genius of Grechko's design was in its perceived insignificance. On radar, its large, non-aerodynamic envelope and slow speed would, in theory, look like weather clutter, a balloon gone astray. It was not a gleaming, aggressive spy plane. It was a ghost, a piece of the sky that didn't belong. Its purpose was singular and audacious: to reach a place no fighter, no missile, and no pilot could survive for long, and to loiter there silently, watching in a realm considered the exclusive domain of satellites. But satellites were predictable. The SR-23K, if it worked, could be sent anywhere the winds allowed, a drifting, deniable eye. But its simplicity was also its curse. The engineers nicknamed it the drunkard. In the thin air, control inputs were sluggish and exaggerated. The center of gravity, shifting with the expansion and contraction of the helium, was a constant worry. The engine, starved for oxygen, would surge and sputter. Controlling it was like trying to balance a pencil on its tip during an earthquake. They had conducted dozens of captive tests, tethered inside the hangar, and a handful of low-altitude flights that ended in crash landings in the soft Siberian snow. Each failure was meticulously documented, each component refined.
Grechko knew that Moscow's patience and their protective general's influence was finite. They needed a successful full-altitude test. They needed to prove the drunkard could sober up and fly its mission.
The launch day, in the late autumn of 1969, dawned clear and bitterly cold. The site was a makeshift strip on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a land of volcanoes and isolation. The team worked with stiff, cold fingers, preparing the 23K. The silvery envelope, filled with precious helium, shimmered in the weak sun like a giant, misplaced Christmas ornament. The engine was checked, the camera loaded with a fresh roll of high-resolution film, the guidance system set for a simple test profile. Launch, climb to 75,000 feet, cruise east over the empty Pacific for 300 kilometers, then descend and hopefully be recovered by a ship waiting in the frigid waters. At Grechko's nod, the release clamps opened. The 23K rose, not with a roar, but with a silent, stately grace. It ascended through the low cloud cover, disappearing from sight. In the cramped tracking van, the team monitored its telemetry, a short-range system that would only work for the first part of the flight. The climb was steady, the engine hummed, the barometric altimeter ticked upwards, 30,000, 50,000, 70,000 feet. A quiet cheer went up. They had never gotten it this high under power before. At 75,000 feet, the autopilot was supposed to level it off. The telemetry showed the command being sent, but the 23K did not level off. A frozen silence descended on the van. The needle on the altimeter dial continued its slow, relentless climb. 76,000, 78,000, 80,000. Grechko's cigarette burned unnoticed in his fingers. Something had gone wrong. The barometric limiter, a tiny aneroid capsule sensitive to pressure, had likely frozen or stuck in the minus 70-degree Fahrenheit cold. The autopilot, receiving no signal to stop climbing, simply held its nose up trim. The thin air meant less drag, and the little engine, inefficient at this height but still producing thrust, pushed the buoyant craft ever higher. "It's in a thermal," one of the meteorologists whispered, pointing to a weather chart. A narrow river of rising air, a stratospheric updraft, was running along the planned flight path. The 23K, light and buoyant, had been caught in it. The drone was now a passenger on an invisible elevator to the edge of space. 85,000 feet, 88,000 feet. The telemetry signal began to break up, fading into static. The last clear reading they got was 90,500 feet. Then the screen went snow white. The 23K had flown beyond the horizon of their receivers. It was gone. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Calculations were frantically made. Wind models were consulted. The path of the high-altitude jet stream was plotted. The grim reality settled over them. The drunkard, sobered by the profound cold of the stratosphere, was not coming down anywhere they could retrieve it. Its trajectory, propelled by the powerful river of air it was now trapped in, was taking it not over the empty Pacific, but on a great circle route, directly towards the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. For an hour, there was only a dreadful, powerless silence. They reported the loss to Moscow in terse, coded language, expecting fury, expecting repercussions. The response was a glacial order: observe radio silence and await instructions. The instructions never came, because by then, the object had appeared on someone else's radar. In the NORAD command center, the initially perplexing track was now being treated with escalating seriousness. Fighters were scrambled. From Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, a pair of F-4 Phantom IIs, their twin jets tearing the sky, climbed with afterburners screaming. They were powerful modern interceptors, but the 90,000-foot ceiling was far beyond their operational envelope. They climbed until their engines began to gasp, until their wings bit into nothingness. Pilots craned their necks, shielding their eyes from the blinding sun, and there, against the dark purple of the near-space sky, they saw it. One pilot in his after-action report described it as a silver jellyfish with wings. It hung almost motionless, a surreal, silent specter. They tried to get a radar lock, but its signature was faint and confused. They had no weapons that could reliably engage it. They were knights on horses, looking up at a castle wall they could not scale. All they could do was watch and track and report. The 23K, oblivious to the diplomatic storm brewing beneath it, continued its serene eastward drift. It passed over the international dateline, crossing from Soviet airspace into American, not with hostile intent, but with the passive indifference of a leaf on the wind. It was now an international incident floating at the edge of space. In Washington and Moscow, secure teletypes chattered. Embassies were put on alert. The question was no longer just technical, it was profoundly political. What was this thing? Was it a weapon, a spy, a bizarre accident? And the most pressing question of all for both superpowers now, what goes up must eventually come down. But where? And with what secrets aboard it? The race was no longer to shoot it down, but to find it when it fell from its unreachable throne. The silent, accidental Voyager had become the most sought-after piece of hardware in the world, a prize drifting on the winds of the stratosphere, carrying with it the fragile film of its unintended reconnaissance and the heavy weight of Cold War intrigue. The alarm that pulsed through the vast nervous system of the American military that day was a unique breed of adrenaline, cold, sharp, laced with a profound and unsettling impotence. The orders that flashed from the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon to Alaskan Air Command were unambiguous: identify and, if hostile, intercept and neutralize. The problem was the verb. Intercept implied a meeting in three-dimensional space. Neutralize suggested the application of force, but the shimmering speck on the radar screens existed in a dimension that seemed to mock those very concepts. At Elmendorf Air Force Base, the klaxons shattered the Arctic morning. Crews, already on high alert since the initial detection, moved with a choreographed urgency born of endless drills. Pilots, strapping themselves into the cockpits of the most advanced interceptors in the world, felt the familiar surge of purpose. They were the tip of the spear, the knights of the sky, tasked with defending the continent's air sovereignty. Their mounts were not steeds, but F-15 Eagles, newly operational, the pinnacle of American aerospace engineering. With their powerful Pratt & Whitney engines, swept wings, and a bristling array of missiles and cannon, they were designed to climb fast, fly high, and destroy anything that threatened the homeland. As the twin canopies hissed shut and the engines spooled up with a deafening, earth-shaking roar, the mission seemed clear. They would climb to meet the intruder, get a visual identification, and, if ordered, send it tumbling into the Bering Sea. The afterburners lit, a pair of searing blue-white torches in the gloom, catapulting the Eagles down the runway and into the sky. They climbed at a near-vertical angle, a demonstration of raw power, punching through cloud layers, the world below quickly flattening into a map. Inside the cockpits, the pilots monitored their instruments, their pressure suits tightening as the atmosphere thinned. The radio chatter was terse, professional. Ground control vectored them toward the target, the blip now designated Bogey Alpha 1. The intercept computer calculated emerge. The distance closed. At 45,000 feet, they entered a realm of profound cold and deep blue. At 60,000 feet, the sky began to darken to indigo. The Eagles were straining now, their engines gulping the thin air, their rate of climb slowing. The pilot's eyes scanned the vast dome of the sky, looking for the telltale glint. The radar in the lead F-15, a powerful APG-63 set, searched, locked, then struggled. The return was faint, jittery, unlike anything in the threat library. It didn't have the sharp, aggressive signature of a bomber or the fast, small bloom of a missile. It was a fuzzy, slow-moving anomaly. "Visual! Visual! 12 o'clock high!" The lead pilot's voice crackled over the secure frequency. They tilted their heads back, their helmets pressing against the seats, and there it was. It was not an aircraft as they understood it. It was a tiny, almost serene, metallic dot, hanging motionless against the infinite curved backdrop of the Earth's limb. It shimmered, a speck of polished silver, catching the unfiltered sunlight where the sky met the blackness of space. It was so high it seemed less like a machine and more like a fixed celestial object, a new, malevolent star. The eagles, these magnificent beasts of war, clawed for every last foot of altitude. They pushed past 70,000 feet, approaching their absolute service ceiling. The buffeting increased. The stall warnings whispered at the edge of the pilot's awareness. They were at the ragged edge of performance, engines screaming, wings generating just enough lift to keep them from mushing back towards Earth. And the drone remained. It was not just above them, it was in another world entirely. A gulf of 15,000 vertical feet, almost 3 miles, separated them. It was a distance that might as well have been 3 million miles. In that moment, the technological supremacy of the United States Air Force evaporated. They were like deep-sea fish, staring up at a bird soaring in the open air. On the ground, in command centers and weapons labs, frantic calculations were run, proposals were shouted. Could a modified surface-to-air missile reach it? The answer was a grim no. Even the powerful Nike Hercules, or the newer SAM-D, which would become the Patriot, had engagement envelopes that topped out far below this stratospheric wanderer. The missiles would arc upwards, their solid fuel rockets burning out, and then, devoid of thrust, would simply curve and fall back to Earth, defeated, not by countermeasures, but by the immutable laws of physics and the empty, indifferent thinness of the air. For the first time in the Cold War, perhaps for the first time in history, the U.S. military found an enemy machine that was, literally, physically, out of reach. It occupied a sanctuary in the sky. It was untouchable. The pilots, their fuel running low, were ordered to break off and return to base. Their after-action reports would be tinged with a strange mixture of professional frustration and awe. They had seen it, they could describe it, but they could not touch it. And it just kept going. Propelled by the fierce river of the polar jet stream, the Isdel 23K began a slow, stately procession eastward. It was no longer just a Soviet machine. It was a tangible manifestation of a new kind of vulnerability. It drifted over the rugged, glacier-carved coastline of Alaska, over the pristine wilderness where America's early warning radar network was blind to anything approaching from below, but now found itself staring helplessly up at an intruder. The drone's path was taking it deeper into North American airspace, a silent, uncatchable burglar strolling through the highest window left unlocked. In the five-sided labyrinth of the Pentagon, a very specific kind of quiet dread began to settle in. It wasn't the hot panic of an incoming attack. It was the cold, creeping anxiety of the unknown. The war room, a sanctum of mahogany and large situation maps, became the nerve center. High-ranking officers from the Air Force, Navy, and the nascent Space Command, alongside civilian analysts from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, crowded around tables littered with photographs, radar plots, and weather charts. The grainy, telescopic images taken by the F-15 pilots were passed from hand to hand. They showed a bizarre, almost comical structure, a bulbous, reflective balloon, a spidery fuselage, long, slender wings. It looked improvised, primitive, and that was somehow more frightening than a sleek, black stealth design. It was unfamiliar. The questions came in rapid, urgent fire. What is its payload? This was the paramount concern. Analysts with expertise in Soviet technical intelligence pored over the images. The protruding lens of the camera was identified. It's a recon platform, high altitude, panoramic, probably film-based. But the fear immediately extrapolated. If it could carry a camera, what else could it carry? The specter of biological or chemical warfare was raised. Could it be a test for a dispersal system? A pathogen or toxin released at 90,000 feet could be carried on the winds for thousands of miles. An invisible, deniable plague. The CIA's Soviet Science Division was tasked with assessing the feasibility. The consensus was grim. Technically possible, but the control and targeting would be nearly impossible. Yet, nearly impossible was not a comfort in the Cold War. What is its purpose right now? Electronic intelligence, ELENT stations, from Shemya Island in the Aleutians to bases in Canada were at full alert. Their massive parabolic dishes tuned to vacuum up any signal emanating from the drone. They heard nothing. No telemetry pulses, no data bursts. The silence was deafening. This led to another, more paranoid theory. Was it a Trojan probe, a passive collector designed to provoke a reaction? As American radars across Alaska and Canada painted it, as fighters scrambled, as SAM sites went to alert status, was it quietly recording the exact frequencies, power levels, and response patterns of the entire North American air defense network? Was this a live-fire exercise for Soviet electronic warfare planners, with the U.S. military playing the role of an unwitting participant? This theory gained traction. It was a classic, clever, asymmetric move, using a cheap, slow, almost silly-looking device to force your adversary to reveal the secrets of his most expensive defenses. But the strangest, most unnerving data point of all came not from radars or spy planes, but from the State Department and the listening posts of the NSA monitoring diplomatic traffic. There was nothing, no protest, no inquiry, not a single carefully worded démarche from the Soviet embassy in Washington. No messages through the hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis to prevent misunderstandings. Radio Moscow's broadcasts continued with their usual bluster about imperialist aggression, but made no mention of a lost aircraft. At the United Nations, Soviet delegates sipped water and discussed grain quotas. This silence from Moscow was louder than any threat. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed every fear, every worst-case scenario. In the Pentagon, they understood the logic, even as it maddened them. For the Kremlin to admit the drone was theirs would be a catastrophic loss of face. It would mean confessing that the Soviet Union had not only built a clandestine spy device, but then had, through incompetence, lost control of it directly over the territory of its primary nuclear rival. It was an admission of both aggression and incompetence, a combination the Politburo would never, ever allow. Better to let the Americans wonder. Better to let them chase a ghost. Deniability was a weapon, and Moscow was wielding it with icy perfection. So, a surreal, two-layered drama unfolded. In the stratosphere, a piece of Soviet machinery drifted on the wind. Below, in the halls of power, American officials wrestled with a phantom. They could see it, but they could not classify it to their satisfaction. They could track it, but they could not stop it. And the only people who could explain it were pretending with absolute conviction that it did not exist. The Cold War had always been a theater of shadows and mirrors, but now the shadow had physical form, and the mirror was reflecting only the anxious faces of those trying to decipher it.
The Izdeliye-23K, this orphan of Soviet engineering, embarked on a lonely, epic journey. For 3 days, it became a temporary, artificial moon of the Arctic. Its path was dictated not by geopolitics, but by geophysics. It was caught in the powerful, sinuous currents of the polar jet stream, a river of air racing at over 200 miles per hour at that altitude. It drifted from the coastal waters of Alaska across the vast, trackless expanse of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories of Canada, a silent observer to mountains, ice fields, and tundra that had never seen a human footprint. Its internal life, however, was ebbing. The lithium batteries, designed for a mission of hours, not days, slowly drained in the intense cold. One by one, systems went dark. The gyroscope and the autopilot, deprived of power, drifted and then froze. The engine, its fuel long exhausted, became a frozen lump of metal, its turbine blades locked in place. The camera's film advance mechanism ceased. The drone was brain dead, a mechanical corpse. Yet it did not fall. This was Victor Grechko's unintended masterstroke, the inherent stability of his hybrid design. With its engine dead and its control surfaces fixed neutral, the 23K became a pure, passive, aerodynamic body. The large helium-filled envelope provided immense buoyancy, acting as a permanent parachute. The long, glider-like wings provided just enough lift to counteract any tendency to tumble. It found a state of equilibrium in the thin air, a slow, stabilizing glide. It was no longer an aircraft, it was a high-altitude leaf, a seed pod of the stratosphere. It had entered a region the world was never meant to enter with sustained presence, the near-space environment, and it had decided to stay. Every attempt by NORAD and the Air Force's Air Weather Service to predict its eventual descent failed miserably. The atmospheric models of the time were rudimentary. The drone's unique drag coefficient, its changing weight as helium slowly diffused through its membrane, the unpredictable turbulence at the edge of space, all of it conspired to make its path a mystery. It would appear to begin a slow descent over Hudson Bay, only to be caught by another rising thermal column and climb back to 85,000 feet. It was toying with them. Briefing papers for the president grew more frustrated. The nation's top scientists were stumped. The object had become a global event, tracked by allies and adversaries alike. In Britain, in France, in China, radar operators watched its progress, a stark lesson in a new kind of aerospace porosity. Then, on the third day, something changed. Not on the drone, but around it. A massive solar flare, a tempest on the surface of the sun, had erupted 2 days prior. Now the resulting coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma, slammed into Earth's magnetosphere. The result was a severe geomagnetic storm, one of the most powerful of the decade. Across Canada and the northern United States, the aurora borealis erupted not in gentle green curtains, but in violent crimson and purple riots that crackled across the entire sky, visible as far south as Virginia. In the stratosphere, where the thin air was already ionized, the effects were profound. The storm induced powerful electrical currents in the upper atmosphere, and the Izdiliye 23K, with its metallized envelope and aluminum trusswork, became an accidental antenna, a tremendous static charge built up on its surface. At the same time, the geomagnetic turbulence violently disrupted the delicate wind patterns of the jet stream. What happened next was a cascade of improbable events, a cosmic intervention in a human drama. A massive, localized downdraft, born of the atmospheric chaos, grabbed the drone. Simultaneously, the built-up static electricity arced across its internal structure. There was no explosion, but a surge of energy that raced through its dead wiring. This surge, by a 1 in a billion chance, found a path to the sole remaining functional component, the emergency pyrotechnic charge connected to the balloon's release mechanism, a failsafe meant for controlled descent that had frozen solid and been written off as inoperable. The charge fired. The brittle cords connecting the envelope to the fuselage severed. The great silver balloon, suddenly free, rocketed upwards, carried by its buoyancy into even thinner air, where it would eventually expand and disintegrate. The skeletal fuselage, now just a heavy, wing-equipped dart, was left to the mercy of gravity and the storm. Released from its buoyant anchor, the carcass of the 23K began a true, final descent. It tipped over, its wings biting into the thicker air, not with a glide, but with a tumble. It started to spin, a slow, then faster rotation as it fell from its heavenly perch. The high-altitude winds, still chaotic from the storm, seized it and threw it eastward on a new, unpredictable ballistic path. In NORAD, the radar signature changed dramatically. The large, slow blob vanished, replaced by a smaller, tumbling return that was beginning a rapid descent. The track shifted. New projections were frantically calculated. The point of impact was no longer predicted to be in the remote Arctic Ocean or the Canadian wilderness. The new plot showed it coming down somewhere in the North Atlantic, far off the coast, but directly along the busy sea lanes between Europe and North America. The silent ghost of Soviet engineering was finally falling, not as a controlled experiment, but as a piece of space debris guided by a solar storm, heading for a crash in the world's busiest ocean. The race was no longer to shoot it down. The race for both superpowers had just become a desperate, secret sprint to find it on the ocean floor before the other could. The story of the drone that flew too high was over. The story of the prize that fell from the sky was about to begin. 7. The fall over forbidden ground. The descent of the Izdili 23K was not a fiery plunge nor a death spiral. After the solar storm's violent intervention stripped it of its buoyant heart, what remained was a skeletal glider, now acting as it was always aerodynamically intended to, as a slow, stable descent vehicle. Freed from the immense lift of the envelope, its heavy wings found purchase in the thickening air. The spin dampened, the tumble stabilized. It entered a gentle, oscillating glide, a metallic leaf pirouetting on thermal currents. It fell from the profound silence of the stratosphere, through the jet stream's howling river, down into the realm of weather, of clouds, of human affairs. For hours it descended, a ghost slipping down a spectral staircase, invisible to most radars now that its large signature was gone, a piece of sky returning to Earth. Its final path was dictated by the prevailing winds of the North Atlantic, and by a cruel twist of geopolitical fate. The winds carried it southeast, away from the remote icy waters where both superpowers had been scrambling ships and submarines in a silent, desperate race for salvage rights. Instead, it drifted towards a chain of islands known more for sheep and fishing villages than for global intrigue. The Shetland Islands, north of Scotland. But on the most remote, windswept peninsula of the main island, there existed a place that was, for Soviet intelligence, a fabled and forbidden ground. It was a classified American and NATO electronic warfare and signal intelligence range known by the innocuous designation Site Raider. To the locals, it was a fenced-off area with peculiar golf ball-like radomes and strange windowless buildings where unmarked cargo planes landed at odd hours. To the Soviets, it was one of the most tantalizing and frustrating targets of the Cold War. Here the United States and its British allies tested the next generation of radar, systems for tracking stealth aircraft, for discriminating warheads from decoys, for guiding anti-ballistic missiles. They tested new communication encryption systems and jam-resistant telemetry. The air above Site Raider was a soup of exotic frequencies, a hidden laboratory of the electromagnetic spectrum. Capturing even a fragment of its technology, or better yet, planting a listening device to study its emissions, was a top priority dream for the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. And now, by a 1,000,000,000 chance, a Soviet-made object was falling directly towards it.
The last moments of the 23K's journey were witnessed only by a lone shepherd and a flock of confused sheep. They saw a strange, silent shape, like a broken kite with long skeletal wings, emerge from the low cloud cover. It made no engine sound. It simply ghosted overhead,
casting a fleeting, jagged shadow on the peat bogs, before disappearing behind a line of low hills. The impact was not a deafening crash, but a complex, crumpling series of thuds and the splintering of old aluminum. It skipped once off a rocky outcrop, shearing off a wing, then plowed a shallow, muddy furrow through heather and bog before coming to rest, partially submerged in a peaty pool, its remaining wing pointing at the gray sky like a grave marker. The shepherd alerted the local constable. The constable, seeing the strange Cyrillic stenciling on a twisted panel, made a call to the mainland. Within an hour, the quiet of the Shetland Hills was shattered by the thunder of twin-rotor CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters, disgorging squads of U.S. Air Force security police in full battle gear. They cordoned off an area a mile in radius. Soon after, a special transport aircraft from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio touched down at the small local airstrip. Aboard was a team from the Foreign Technology Division, FTD, America's elite airframe aliens, men whose job was to take apart the enemy's machines and divine their secrets. They arrived expecting a treasure trove. They had been briefed on a Soviet vehicle that had operated at the edge of space, that had outfoxed NORAD for days. They expected micro-miniaturized electronics, exotic composite materials, perhaps even a primitive stealth coating. They expected cutting-edge Soviet tech. What they found, lying broken in the Scottish mire, was a profound paradox. Under the glare of portable floodlights, in the constant damp wind, they beheld an artifact of astonishing crudeness. The envelope was gone, of course. What remained was the fuselage truss, a collection of welded titanium tubes, but the welding was sloppy, the alignment imperfect. The skin was not advanced composite, but riveted aluminum panels of varying thicknesses, some showing evidence of having been cut from other aircraft. The team identified alloy types used in old Antonov cargo plane flooring. The engine, once they fished it from the peat, was a modified Tumansky R9 turbojet, a decades-old design used in early MiG-19s, its components visibly hand-fitted with shims and extra brackets. The fuel tank was a repurposed stainless steel vessel of a type used in agricultural sprayers. The guidance system was the most shocking. They had anticipated a sophisticated inertial navigation unit or a star tracker. Instead, in a crushed aluminum box, they found a mechanical autopilot. It contained a gyroscope from a WW2-era German V-2 rocket, likely war booty, its bearings worn. The barometric altimeter was a standard aviation unit, its aneroid capsule visibly frozen and cracked. There were no transistors, no integrated circuits, just relays, solenoids, and a clockwork timer that could have been built in a 1940s high school shop class. It was so primitive, it belonged in a museum of early aviation, not at the scene of a 1970s technological standoff. The FTD team was left stunned. There was a profound silence, broken only by the whipping of the wind and the clicking of cameras. The lead engineer, a man named Dr. Alan Cresswell, who had reverse-engineered MiG-21s and SAM guidance systems, crouched in the mud, turning a piece of scavenged actuator in his hand. The engineers were baffled, not just by the obvious crudeness, but by the obvious inconsistencies. Researchers could not compute. The wreckage was carefully catalogued, packaged in unmarked crates, and flown under maximum secrecy to the ultimate trophy room of the Cold War, Hangar 5 at Wright-Patterson's Foreign Technology Division. Here, under the bright, sterile lights of a clean room, the 23K was laid out on tarps like a cadaver on an autopsy table. For weeks, teams of engineers, metallurgists, electrical specialists, and intelligence analysts swarmed over it. Every bolt was examined, every wire traced, every speck of paint analyzed with mass spectrometers. The initial report, a cursory classification, labeled it a low-technology, high-altitude reconnaissance platform of limited utility. But as the dissection went deeper, strange anomalies began to surface. The story told by the parts was not as simple as the story told by the whole. If the machine was so primitive, a question gnawed at Dr. Cresswell and his team. Why had the Soviets built it? The USSR was not a nation that wasted resources on scientific whimsy. Every project, especially in the defense sector, had a clear doctrinal purpose. A cheap, disposable spy camera? Perhaps. But the deeper they looked, the less that explanation held. The wiring harness, though crude, was not standard aviation grade. It was a special, heavily shielded cable, of a type used in satellite construction. Shielding analysis revealed it was designed to protect against extreme radiation, the kind found not in the upper atmosphere, but in the Van Allen belts or in deep space. Why would a balloon drone need protection from cosmic rays and solar particle events? Then there were the sensor ports. The primary camera was straightforward, but next to its mounting were secondary ports, empty now, with connector interfaces that didn't match any known Soviet camera or ELINT package. Spectrum analysis of residue around these ports revealed traces of materials used in sensors tuned to very specific frequencies, the microwave bands used for tracking and communicating with orbital platforms. This drone had ports for staring not down at the Earth, but up at the stars. Most puzzling was the central payload mount. It was a sturdy, vibration-isolated platform in the center of the fuselage, empty now. But its design was massively over-engineered for the simple panoramic camera that had been mounted off to the side. The bolt patterns, power couplings, and data ports on this main mount were not standard. Forensic reconstruction showed it was designed to carry a payload of approximately 22 kilograms, a compact cylindrical shape. The wiring leading to it was compatible with the power needs and signal types of one thing and one thing only in the Soviet inventory: the KEG series of nuclear detonation detection and atmospheric sampling payloads used on their satellites. The pieces began to form a new, more disturbing picture. This wasn't merely a spy craft. Its radiation shielding, its satellite-compatible sensors, its nuclear sniffer wiring suggested a different mission profile entirely. It was a test bed, a proof of concept for operating in a specific lethal environment. The high altitude wasn't just for observation, it was a simulation. It was the closest you could get to the radiation environment and observation vantage point of low Earth orbit without actually building and launching a satellite. The 23K was a poor man's satellite, a way to test sensors, shielding, and stabilization systems for something else. But a test for what? The evidence pointed upwards, to an orbital platform, perhaps an unmanned space station module, or, more darkly, to the rumored Soviet Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, FOBS, a weapon designed to skim the edge of space. You would need a way to test its sensors and hardening without announcing your intentions to the world with a rocket launch. A high-altitude drone, drifting silently and deniably, would be perfect. And then came the final chilling discovery. The empty main payload mount showed clear signs of a rushed, non-standard removal. Tool marks that didn't match any Soviet wrench. Sheared bolts that suggested not a crash break, but a pre-impact detachment. The wiring to it had been neatly severed with diagonal cutters, not torn. Forensic pathologists have a term for a body found without a vital organ, a missing organ weight discrepancy. The 23K had a missing organ weight discrepancy, something roughly the size of a basketball and weighing about 22 kilograms, had been deliberately taken off the drone before it crashed.
The investigation had begun to answer a question, but in doing so, it raised one that was far more profound and unsettling. This crude drone was a stepping stone to something bigger, something meant for orbit. And a key piece of that something, the very payload this whole test was designed to carry, was now missing, lost somewhere between the stratosphere and a Scottish bog.
The final report of the Foreign Technology Division, compiled over 6 months and stamped with a classification higher than top secret, code word Umbra, ran to over 500 pages. Its executive summary, declassified only in the early 2000s after relentless Freedom of Information Act requests, is a masterpiece of clinical, bureaucratic language that barely contains a profound strategic revelation. The report's conclusion was unambiguous and, in its own way, anticlimactic. The ISDL-23K, it stated, posed no direct threat. It was not a weapon. Its reconnaissance capabilities, while novel, were of limited strategic value compared to satellite imagery. It wasn't even designed to be retrieved. Its simplicity was its disposability. The film would have been automatically jettisoned with a small parachute over Soviet territory if the mission had gone to plan. The core finding was this: the drone was a prototype for a high-altitude, long-endurance sensor carrier platform. In plainer terms, it was a test for a kind of atmospheric satellite, a pseudo-satellite, meant to fill a gap between expensive orbital hardware and vulnerable spy planes. It was a stepping stone in a Soviet program to dominate what they called the astrosphere, the conceptual space between air and space. The program, the FTD analysts deduced from component dates and manufacturing clues, had been active in the late 1960s, championed by a small, marginal design bureau. It had likely been canceled around 1971 or 72, a victim of budget cuts, the rise of reliable photo-reconnaissance satellites, and perhaps internal political battles. The runaway 23K was a zombie, a ghost from a canceled program, a machine that had been built, put in storage, and then perhaps dusted off for one final systems check by a lower-ranking officer, leading to the fateful, catastrophic launch. It was an orphan of a dead-end project, forgotten by all but a handful of aging engineers in Novosibirsk, and yet it had, through a cascade of failures and cosmic chance, completed the most spectacular demonstration flight in aviation history, all the way to a muddy grave in America's backyard. The report framed it as a historical curiosity, a technological dead branch on the tree of aerospace evolution. But appended to the main report were the annexes, the ones that discussed the radiation shielding, the orbital frequency sensor ports, the nuclear detection payload wiring. These annexes were not declassified. Their conclusions were hinted at only in heavily redacted memos between the FTD and the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. These memos suggested a secondary, more speculative potential application related to orbital weapon system sensor testing and extra-atmospheric radiological biology experiments. The program might have been abandoned, but the thinking behind it, the desire to own the gateway to space with cheap, disposable platforms, clearly was not. 10. The part the Soviets never explained. To this day, in the official archives of the Russian Federation, there is no record of ISDL-23K. No design bureaus claim it. No veterans of the Soviet aerospace industry speak of it in memoirs. In the grand narrative of Russian technological achievement, from Sputnik to Buran, it does not exist. It is a non-person of engineering. Moscow's enduring, stone-faced denial is the final, flawless layer of its operational security. To admit it existed is to admit fallibility, to open a door to questions they will never answer. The declassified U.S. documents, however, agree with forensic certainty on one disturbing, unresolved detail. It is a detail that transforms the story from a curious Cold War anecdote into a lingering mystery. The drone's primary payload mount was empty. The tool marks indicated a professional, deliberate removal. The wiring was cleanly cut. The payload it was designed to carry was consistent in size, weight, and interface with a Soviet ROMB-1 atmospheric sampler, a device used to detect radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests or from the reactor plume of a nuclear-powered satellite, or something far worse. The ROMB-1 had a cousin, known only by the designation Object 452. CIA files describe it as an experimental aerosol dispersion package of similar dimensions. Its purpose is redacted, but adjacent paragraphs discuss concerns about Soviet radiological warfare concepts and high-altitude pathogen viability studies. The prevailing theory among the few cleared to know the full story is this: the 23K was launched not just as a systems test, but with a live experimental payload, something related to the nuclear or biological weapons program. When the drone went rogue, soaring not over the empty Pacific, but over Alaska and Canada, panic erupted in the small team that launched it. They would have faced not just embarrassment, but execution for losing a weapon of mass destruction-related experiment over enemy territory. The orders for Moscow would have been absolute. It must not be recovered intact by the Americans. And so, as the drone began its final, uncontrolled descent over the North Atlantic, a different, more secret race was happening. A Soviet submarine, or perhaps a fishing trawler from the intelligence fleet, was likely dispatched to the predicted splashdown zone in the hours before the solar storm altered its course. Their mission to locate the floating wreckage, board it, and remove the payload before any NATO ships could arrive. The storm-driven change in trajectory foiled that plan, sending the drone inland to site GARD-ER. But what if they had another option? The most chilling, unproven scenario lies in a single line from an NSA intercept, partially decoded from a Soviet naval signal on that fourth day. Continuing, package jettison confirmed over grid sector. The grid sector referenced is a 1,000-square-mile patch of the deepest part of the North Atlantic, the Faraday Abyssal Plain. The conclusion is as simple as it is haunting. Whatever the ISDL-23K once carried, be it a nuclear sniffer, a bioweapon testbed, or some other dark child of Cold War science, was not destroyed in the crash. It was not found in the Scottish peat. It was deliberately cast off into the sea during the drone's final hours aloft on a direct order from Moscow. It sits now, and for all eternity, in a pressurized, radiation-shielded cylinder, slowly corroding on the ocean floor 4 miles down in perpetual darkness. Its secrets remain intact, guarded by immense pressure and impossible depth, a final, untouchable monument to an era when two nations, in their paranoia and ambition, would send even their most terrible ideas to the very edge of heaven.